Hello, my name is Jessica Teets, and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science at Middlebury College. And I'm going to be speaking to you today about Xi Jinping's reform agenda. I think what we're seeing that's really interesting about this reform agenda is that it's not simply a list of proposed economic reforms, but instead it's the broad outline of a new social contract. And Xi Jinping is calling this social contract the China Dream. Sometimes it's also translated as the Chinese Dream. But both of these terms are referencing a social contract that Xi Jinping is offering to the Chinese people to replace the harmonious society that Hu Jintao used. And I think that the difference between the China Dream and harmonious society is that the Chinese dream concept is a little bit broader, and I think in some ways is a really fundamental change from what we've seen in the past. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what specific reforms are part of the China Dream, and then try to, because we don't know exactly, but try to think through what exactly this new social contract looks like. And then we can talk about how does this depart from harmonious society or other policies that we've seen in the past. So to begin very quickly, for how Xi Jinping himself talks about the China Dream, you can see the quotation on the first slide where he talks about the greatest dream of modern times is realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And to achieve the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, this would be to achieve national prosperity, revitalization of the nation, and people's happiness. These are fairly broad terms, so let's look a little bit more at the specifics as to how he intends to reach these goals. And so most of the specifics that we currently know about are in the 60-point decision. And this was given at the third plenum in 2012 when Xi Jinping had just taken office. So this is the very first document where he lays out his vision for how to reach the China Dream. And in the 60-point decision, the four main foci seem to be, first of all, a new commitment to financial liberalization. And this is similar to what we saw in the early reform era under Premier Zhu Rongji. We also, though, see a new concept looking at creating and repairing the social safety net, and this is a new focus. We also see new protections on property rights, especially rural land, and also a greater reliance on market forces and maybe less of an emphasis on state planning. But we'll examine each one of these concepts in turn to see specifically what we're looking at. So to start with the economic reform goals, again, we're looking at financial liberalization and more of a protection of property rights. And the specific reforms that we're seeing that do this are, first of all, to set market rates for loans and deposits. And so what this essentially means is that rather than the state determining the rate at which money can be lent, instead the market will determine this. We're very familiar with this concept in the United States, especially those of us with mortgages, but this is a new concept in China where the state previously set the interest rate. We also see that there's going to be more private investor participation in state-owned enterprises, and I doubt that this is going to take the form of complete privatization of state-owned enterprises, but more likely what this will look like are that private investors will be able to start taking larger and larger shares in state-owned enterprises. We also see that there's going to be an increase in the role of private enterprise. And I'd like to pause before we go on to the last point and quickly look at this, the state-owned enterprise reforms. And the reason that I want to pause here is that the state-owned enterprise reforms really seem to focus on the introduction of competition as a way to reform state-owned enterprises. So rather than the state intervening and trying to have better governance of state-owned enterprises, the goal seems to be introducing more market dynamics, more competitive dynamics. And the specific reforms that we see that should do this are, first of all, that state-owned enterprises will no longer have soft budget constraints. So they will have to remit about 30% of their dividends to the state, which is basically a tax on state-owned enterprises where they need to have profits. Also, the language has changed. And as always in China, language is very important. And so the specific language says that markets will have a decisive rather than fundamental role in resource allocation as the major theoretical principle aimed at reducing monopoly power. So this is a pretty firm statement that we expect to see more competition, and we expect to see that state-owned enterprises behave like any other market-based firm. And again, we also see that the markets will set interest rates, which means that state-owned enterprises will no longer have access to easy credit. In some cases, these were government-subsidized loans with very low interest rates, sometimes at 0%. So this means that firms will need to be competitive. They will need to earn a profit. We also see, and this is a very interesting development, that private firms will now be allowed to have initial public offerings on the Chinese stock market, rather than simply large state-owned firms. And this will be a way for them to gain the capital necessary to compete with state-owned enterprises. Let's reverse and go back to talking about economic reform goals, because I wanted to focus on the property taxes to boost revenue for local government. This might seem like a very minor reform compared to reform of the whole state-owned enterprise sector, but this is actually a very big reform. So in China, we see that about 70% of social spending is at the local level rather than the central level. And by social spending, I mean pensions, healthcare, education, low-income subsidies. All of these sorts of programs are paid for at the local level. Unfortunately, at the local level, especially for poorer provinces that don't have a lot of business taxes, there aren't a lot of ways for local government to raise money. And so what they've been doing is they've been illegally seizing and selling land to developers. And so a way to perhaps get around the housing bubble and the land bubble that we might see forming in China is to introduce property taxes. And this would allow local governments to collect a property tax for things like apartments or land sales. And that this would be a way for them to gain legitimate revenue rather than this extra budgetary revenue that they gain through the illegal sale of land. So this might fundamentally transform local government financing and is a very interesting reform that we should watch. But let's move on now and talk a little bit more about social reform goals. We talked about how Xi Jinping wants to repair and in some cases build from scratch a social safety net as part of the China Dream policy. And so what he is saying that he's going to do under the social safety net is that he's going to change the one-child policy, which has already in recent years basically become a de facto two-child policy. But this policy will be relaxed. He will end labor camps, meaning that dissidents or activists who are found to be disturbing the public order can no longer be sentenced in cases that are done outside of the court system and are merely decided by the party. And so the party will decide that an activist is disturbing the public order, and this person without a court trial can be sent to a labor camp. So that practice will end. We also see, again, more of a focus on greater land rights for farmers and a reform of the hukou system. And the hukou system is simply the geographical residence, which is denoted in a residence card, and this is often called the hukou. And this residence card basically is what allows residents to have access to the social security system. So things like subsidized health care, subsidized education, low-income subsidies, low-income housing, all of these services are tied to a hukou card. And so if you don't have this card, if you don't have a hukou, that means that you can still get these services, but you have to get them through the private market and you have to pay full price. And this introduces a lot of inequality between those who have urban hukous and those without, who are also living in the same cities. We also see that there's going to be more emphasis on independence in the judicial system, although it's unclear exactly what this means. So I wanted to pause for a second to talk about the land reform and the hukou reform, because the hope is that this will help close the urban-rural income gap that we see in China. So if farmers are granted land rights where if they move to cities they could sell, lease, or rent their land, the idea behind this would be that farmers then, if this were their private property, they could gain extra financial resources to use in setting up a new life in the cities. So right now, when farmers move, when farmers move to cities to work, they really view the land as a safety net. So if something happens to them in the city, they can always return to the land. But since they can't currently sell that land, what it means is that they don't have any financial resources when they get to the city. So the idea would be instead that if they could sell or rent or lease this land, they would have a certain amount of financial resources that would help them establish a new life in the cities. We also see with the hukou reform that this would allow rural residents to move to mostly smaller cities. There would still be restrictions on the large cities like Beijing and Shanghai, but rural residents could move to smaller cities, take jobs there, and they would have access to the same benefits that urban residents would have. And again, this is very important as far as the inequality that we see between urban residents who hold a hukou and rural residents currently living in cities but who don't have access to hukous. And I wanted to end with the last group of reforms that we see, and these are political reforms, and they really seem to focus on the revitalization of the party, making the party stronger and hopefully cleaner. And so what we see in the revitalization of the party is that Xi Jinping seems to intend that the party will play much more of a leadership role in both market and society than we might have seen in the past. And so the two major reforms that we see that give us this indication is, first of all, the formation of a National Security Council. And so this would move security more firmly under the party, especially internal security, like social stability. So this would move more control for security into the party and away from the public security ministry and bureaus. We also see another such shift would be in economic reforms. So right now, economic reforms are mostly handled by the NDRC, and this is a body that is responsible for writing documents like the 5-year plans. So this body inside of the state is the one that that is in charge of doing all economic reform, all economic planning. However, Xi Jinping has created a small leading group that is inside of the party that will now be responsible for economic reform. So this really shifts power, both of these reforms actually shift power from the state to the party. And so we see an increased emphasis on the role of the party, a strong role of the party. And this leads us to the question of what is the China dream? So I've talked about it as a social compact or a social contract. And a social compact or a social contract is signifying that these are promises that the government is making to citizens, and this is the basis of their legitimacy, their ability to deliver upon these promises. And so when we think then about Xi Jinping creating a new social contract to govern the Chinese nation, what exactly is this? And so based on the reforms that we've seen thus far, it seems that there are a number of things that the China dream could be. And so one is this idea of a dream of social justice or of social mobility, similar to what we see with the American dream. And if we think about this comparison, the American dream concept is this idea of social mobility, where through hard work and investment in education, children can do better than their parents before them. And so if we think about, is that the type of China dream that we're going to see? If we look at comparative statistics, we can see that the United States doesn't have a lot of social mobility. So if we look at the likelihood that children will earn the same amount of money as their parents or be in the same social class as their parents, we see that about 47% of a child's earning potential is decided by their parents' earning potential. So this means that only half of your hard work or your investment in education will actually matter for your long-term income. In China, we see that this is even more so the case. And so in China, about 63% of a child's income is determined by their parents' income, meaning that there's less possibility for social mobility. So when we think then about is this China dream a dream of social justice and social mobility, it seems that this is less likely, although we are seeing reforms of the hukou and of rural land, which should decrease the gap we see between urban and rural salaries. So there is some social justice and social mobility aspect there, but it's unclear if this would be enough. We could also talk about the China dream as maybe a dream of capitalist reform, of continuing the economic reforms that were begun under Premier Zhu Rongji and President Jiang Zemin, but had to halt because of so much social pressure and unemployment and bankruptcy of state-owned enterprises. And so it might be that the China dream is picking up on those capitalist reforms that stalled and continuing these. And that certainly seems to be the case, that there's a focus on strong economic reform and market-led economic reforms. We could also talk about the China dream perhaps as a dream of democracy. And so for people who look at items such as the judicial independence that we saw in the 60-point plan, a group of people in China who call themselves the constitutionalists argue that this idea of judicial independence creates rule of law in China, and so that the China dream might be one of democracy or of more social power inside of China. This is unclear to me if this is in fact the case. It seems that the judicial independence simply means a division from local government interests, but not ultimately from the party. And in fact, what we see, and this is the last bullet point here, is that it seems to be that the China dream is less about democracy, but more about creating a strong state and a strong party to for China to develop into a superpower. And so if we want to think about what sort of evidence do we see that this is a dream of the strong state, if we look at Chinese military spending and Chinese military capacity, we see that these have been increasing to the point that if we look at things like Army personnel, we see that China clearly outstrips the United States, although the United States still leads with Air Force and Navy personnel, which many would argue are the hallmark of a more modern military. If we look at spending, we see that China is second only to the United States in military spending. But again, if we look at the gap between these spending levels, we see that the United States clearly outspends China. So it does seem that China is going to continue to focus on creating a strong modern military. And so the last concept that I wanted to bring up is this dream of a strong party. And it seems to me that the China dream is fundamentally different from the dreams that we've seen in the past of the Three Represents from Jiang Zemin or Harmonious Society from Hu Jintao. And the reason is that it seems that the China dream concept is really focusing on changing fundamental aspects of China that we've seen since 1978 that have created a lot of governance problems. So by reforming the hukou, by trying to reform rural land, by trying to really tackle the problems with state-owned enterprises, namely the lack of competition and soft budget constraints, these reforms really seem to indicate a willingness, a political will to engage with really difficult problems facing China that might impede its future growth. And so it seems that the China dream concept is different from dreams we've seen in the past in that it seems willing to focus on the problems facing China and to deal with these in, I think, a surprisingly strong manner so early in Xi Jinping's tenure. But as far as what this dream is as a social contract remains open to interpretation. And I think that all of these elements that I've brought up are found in the China dream concept, but it's unclear if one of these will be dominant. So this is something, of course, that we have to continue to watch throughout Xi Jinping's tenure, how the China dream concept evolves and adapts. But I do think that we're seeing a fundamental break with reforms in the past and a strong political will to tackle the problems that we've seen in China. Thank you very much for your time.